All right, fantastic. Thank you all for joining. I'll start with some introductory remarks as everyone's kind of joining into the discussion so we can get started promptly for our today's presentation. So hello and welcome to today's CID speaker series. My name is Sarah Luttrell and I'm the Communications and Events Manager here at the Center for International Development at Harvard University. I'm excited for today's discussion on the dual dimensions of political ideology. The format for today's discussion will be with about a 20-minute presentation, and then we'll open up for about 20 minutes of question and answer with the audience. But before we get started, I want to go over a couple of housekeeping items. So during the Q&A portion of the event, you can submit your questions directly in the chat, or you can use the raise your hand function. It's preferable if you could use the raise hand function so that you can ask your questions directly to Ananish, today's speaker. We're also recording today's session, and the session will be available on CID's YouTube channel after the event. I will also add links to sign up for our newsletter and our social media channels to hear more about events like this coming up in the future. And finally, so for our next week's CID speaker series, we're featuring George Gray Molina, who is the chief economist at the UN Development Program's Global Policy Bureau. He will be presenting the findings of a recent UNDP report that provides estimate of a temporary basic income for all poor and vulnerable people in the developing world. We hope that you'll register and join us for that talk on Friday, October 9th. And I'll put a link in the chat to be able to register for that. But without further ado, I would like to introduce our speaker for today, Ananish Chaudhuri. Ananish is a professor of experimental economics at the University of Auckland. He is the founder and director of DECIDE, which is the University of Auckland Business Decision Making Lab. He has published widely in leading international scholarly journals and is the author of a critically acclaimed book, Experiments in Economics, Playing Fair with Money. So Ananish, thank you very much for being with us here today, and over to you.
Hello, can you hear me? Okay. Hey, good afternoon, good morning. It's good morning for me here. So thank you all for being here. This seminar was supposed to be held last semester when I was teaching a course in the area of management, leadership, and decision making. I was teaching MLD 302, behavioral decision making. But because the campus closed down, we couldn't do it. So we are now doing it finally. So thank you all for being here. I don't see any of my students here, but in case you run into someone who took MLD 302 with me, you can tell them that the course that I taught, I told them at the time that I was writing up my notes in the form of a book. So I've completed that, and that's been submitted. It should be out from Routledge in the near future. And many of them feature in the book and many of the examples and things like that. So having said that, bit of naked self-promotion. Let me get started. Now, let me tell you quickly. So I have my laptop here, but I have a much bigger screen to the side. So if I'm looking away from you, that doesn't mean I'm disrespecting you. I'm simply looking at the screen, on the big screen where I can see my presentation. All right, let's get started. So I'm going to start talking, and you are most welcome to stop me and ask questions as we go along. So you don't have to wait for your questions till the end, but depending on what the question is, I might say that I would like to hold it off for a little bit before I answer that question, all right? But please feel free to chip in anytime you want. Okay, so let me start the slideshow. Okay, I hope you can see my slides, which says dual evolutionary foundations of political ideology or ideology. It's, I still speak a bit of a mix of American and English, like the Queen's English, because I've now lived here for a while. Okay, so let's get started. So what I'm going to talk about. So before I start, let me just talk about a little bit about my research team, my collaborators. So this is a large research project with a bunch of people. And so there's me. There's one of my collaborators. His name is Quintin Atkinson. Quintin actually did present a talk to my course at Harvard last semester. Then we have Chris Sibley, who's a key part of this project. And some of the stuff I'm going to present is with two PhD students, Scott Claessens and Kyle Fisher, both of whom moved here from England. Okay, so what are we going to talk about? This is going to be relevant, I think. So let me start with a bit of background. So as you head into elections, you will hear a lot of this, right? So you have these types of people. I assume you know who they are. The one in the middle is Jeremy Corbyn, the British Labour politician, and you probably know who these people are as well. Now, what happens is in day-to-day parlance, we kind of, if you read newspaper articles, people talking on television, we call these people on the left liberals. We call the people on the right conservatives. But this view of politics is at the very least incomplete, if not inaccurate. Mostly because the people that we call liberals and conservatives don't necessarily agree on a whole bunch of things. So, to use technical jargon, if you kind of analyze their positions, you have what's called low internal consistency. They're not really consistent across their views. Sometimes those views are not really applicable to areas outside of politics or to other topics. And those of you who know this, people, if you have a background in psychology, then you will know that psychologists use a lot of analysis called factor analysis, where they try and look for kind of major explaining factors. And when you look at liberals, conservatives, you will find that their positions actually reveal more than one position. So essentially what that is saying is it is not an unidimensional spectrum at all. So to give you an example, one very popular view of this unidimensional view of politics is kind of embodied in this book called The Righteous Mind by Jonathan Haidt. Many of you probably have know about this work or know about Haidt. He has this recent book called The Coddling of the American Mind. So, but Haidt in some ways sums up this unidimensional view of politics. So Haidt says, in his moral foundations theory, Haidt says that there are five things that we care about. We care about harm, fairness, in-group loyalty, authority, and sanctity. I'm going to leave the definitions kind of unsaid right now, but I'm sure you understand what this means. Harm, fairness, in-group loyalty, authority. Sanctity is things along the lines of, purity of the human body, sanctity of marriage, and things along those lines. So but feel free to chip in and ask a question if you want. So what does Haidt say? Haidt says that when you ask people questions along these lines, then here's what happens. Now, you will probably understand that in most parts of the world, red is reserved for the leftists, right? The leftists use the color, Labour parties use red, while the conservatives use blue. United States is the only opposite, where the Republicans, they always wear red ties, but that's not true. So I'm going to use consistently use red for leftists and blue for rightists. So when you ask questions like this, how fair is it? Are you willing to cause harm to others? What Haidt says is that if you look at liberals, then liberals, everyone cares about everything. They care about all these things, loyalty, in-group love, etc. But liberals care especially about harm and fairness. They care about redistributive justice and things along those lines. Conservatives, on the other hand, care much more. It's not that they don't care about harm and fairness, but they care much more about things like in-group loyalty, you know, obedience to authority, kind of following group norms and things along those lines. But as I will show you shortly, these two sets of things, harm and fairness on the other hand, and authority, sanctity, in-group loyalty, etc. on the other hand, these two things represent two very basic drivers of human behavior. So these are not really different moral foundations in that sense. Okay. So let me start by talking about our first paper, which is the dual foundations of political ideology. So let me go through a little bit of that. So as I said, there is an enormous amount of discussion about this unidimensional liberal conservative idea. But evidence from diverse areas of the social sciences suggests that there are at least two distinct dimensions to each of these ideas. And what are those distinct dimensions? You can think of economic conservatism, and I will use the word economic progressivism. I could say economic liberalism, but I will call it progressivism for the time being. Now, the semantics here are a little bit important. I'll kind of clarify that as I go along, but I put a plus and a minus because in what follows, I will kind of put this in terms of economic conservatism going up or going down. What that means is if conservatism goes up, then progressivism goes down. So you're moving along either the vertical dimension or you are going to move along a horizontal dimension, which encompasses social conservatism versus social progressivism. I'll explain this in a minute. So what they're simply saying is that it doesn't make a lot of sense to say conservatives and liberals. You need to make a finer, more nuanced distinction of this view by looking at what could be called an economic dimension and a social dimension. So let me explain this in a little bit. Okay. So the question is, and what I'm trying to say here is that there is an enormous amount of evidence in social sciences that these two dimensions exist. So it's not quite right to put people on a single unidimensional spectrum. So the first question is, why these two dimensions? And one answer to that question is that if you think of social life as a game, then political behavior aims to negotiate the rules of that game, who's entitled to get what, when, and how. So politics is produced by adaptations designed to solve the coordination problems that emerge from group living. So essentially, we are all trying to solve these kind of collective action type of problems. So we believe that there are two unique aspects of human group living, or in moving from kind of higher apes to complex human societies, we needed to make two major jumps, two major leaps. The first of this is cooperating across wide groups of people. So cooperating with strangers, cooperating with people who are not our genetic kin. We prefer to cooperate with others who cooperate. We display notions of altruism, trust, reciprocity, and we often do these things even without any future benefit. So I will help someone even if that person is a stranger to me. So that was the first leap, this idea that we need to know how to cooperate. We needed to learn how to cooperate across large groups of people. But the problem, of course, is this kind of cooperation is vulnerable to free riding. The cheaters can take advantage of cooperators, which means that in the second stage, we needed to figure out how the group can survive. So we needed to evolve rules for group conformity. And the way we do that is by adhering to group-wide social norms. We kind of feel guilt and shame when we violate those social norms. And more importantly, we punish norm violators. So we punish people who take advantage of our cooperation. And as many of you will know, we often use kind of signals or cultural markers to delineate who my in-group is from the out-group, right? Clothes, religious rituals, and things along those lines. So what we are saying is that the dual dimensions of political ideology evolved from these two fundamental dimensions of human existence. The first, that I will call the cooperative competitive dimension, which is this idea of cooperating across a wide interdependent network that are not necessarily our genetic kin. So in the ancestral past, we had to navigate these dilemmas. And therefore, today, this preference for cooperation or not all of us will do the same thing, but this preference for cooperation will underlie our economic preferences, such as progressive income taxation, income redistribution, environmentalism, welfare state, and we'll take different positions on these issues. So that's the first dimension. The second dimension, as I said, is related to group conformity, group survival. How do we make sure that my clan, my tribe, my group survives and does better than others? And so we need to have rules for group conformity. We need to make sure the in-group survives. We need to make sure that we punish who violate those group norms, etc. And therefore, we expect this dimension to underlie our issues or our positions about things like traditional social values, criminal justice, patriotism, and national security. So what I'm saying is that we need to think about political positions as positions on these four quadrants. So you have economic conservatism as opposed to economic progressivism. Economic conservatism says that it's a competitive dog-eat-dog world. This is a view that's reasonably comfortable with hierarchy, inequality. You can think of this as a view that promotes limited government. The other end of that spectrum, of course, is progressivism, which is redistributive policies, justice, equality, etc. So that's the economics dimension. And then you have the social dimension. But the social conservatives view the world as a dangerous place. So these are people who are very threat sensitive. So they believe that it's very important to obey authority, to follow the norms of the group. The other end, of course, is social progressivism, which emphasizes individual rights and liberties. So the first thing to do to understand political positions, political stances, is to think about these four quadrants. So economic conservatism then is a view that thinks that competition is good. If as conservative increases, competition in the sense of kind of competing for scarce resources increases or is supported. Progressivism, on the other hand, views cooperation as a good thing. Social conservatives emphasize groupishness. Social progressives emphasize individualism. So typically, at least in Western societies, now those of you who are from say, the third world, from developing countries, or even Latin America, you may actually kind of think about these terms a bit differently. But once again, this is just a matter of semantics. All I'm saying is I'm going to define economic conservatives as those who are kind of small government, free markets. Progressives are kind of redistribution and large government. Social conservatives are very groupish. Social progressives emphasize individual rights. So at least in most Western democracies, the people in this first quadrant are typically called conservatives. People in this third quadrant, social progressives and economic progressives, are typically called liberals. People in the second quadrant, who believe in small government but individual rights, are usually called libertarians. And people who belong to this fourth quadrant, who believe in groupishness but also kind of large government, etc., are typically called populists. But these are not universally accepted terms, and it does differ a little bit. But let me give you an idea of what I'm talking about. So for instance, libertarians in the US support economically conservative positions like free markets and pro-business policies, but typically hold socially progressive views on abortion, same-sex marriage, etc. In Europe, on the other hand, even in New Zealand to some extent, not so much in New Zealand, but maybe Australia, people are voting for parties that are economically progressive, that support the welfare state, redistributive policies, but they're also kind of socially conservative in the sense that they are opposed to greater ethnic diversity, right? Once again, broad generalizations, but I'm assuming that you get the idea. And the final question then is, how does this come about? For instance, why don't we all end up in one or two of those quadrants? Why don't we all end up in the first quadrant, on the third quadrant, etc.? And the typical answer to this would be that this variation, if you think about evolved brains having two dials, think of this as each of us has these dials set in different places. And the way that it comes about is, one is this idea of balancing selection via fitness trade-offs, heritable differences. I don't know if this is going to be controversial for you guys or not, but now we have enough evidence that even political preferences are heritable, along with other kind of behavioral characteristics. And the other, of course, is behavioral plasticity, which simply says that, I may have some preferences. Some of them get expressed more given the socio-ecological conditions. So essentially these, if you think about these two dials being set at different places in our brains, then it's a product of both gene culture coevolution. So each of us kind of have different views on this. So it's kind of not so good to think about simply liberal conservative, but it's more important to think about kind of people's positions on those quadrants rather than along a line. Okay. I'm going to pause here to see if there are any questions. I've already said quite a few things. If not, and if you are mostly okay, Sarah, is this making sense somewhat?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Okay, so now, having done that, of course, you could say, okay, so what? So now, in some ways, we got to measure some of these things, right? So we got to figure out what this means for our day-to-day lives. So I'm going to move on to a second paper. Cooperative phenotype predicts economic conservatism, policy views, and political party support. So what are we going to do now is we got to measure these things, right? So if I say economic, as I said, I'm going to use the measure of economic conservatism and social conservatism. So when economic conservatism goes up, economic progressivism goes down, etc., right? So just to keep things simple, I'm going to talk about conservatism going up or down. And I'm sure you understand that one going up means the other going down. Okay. So what we're going to do is we're going to take these two scales. These are reasonably well validated scales that's used quite extensively in political science, political psychology. So we're going to use this scale called social dominance orientation, and this is going to be our measure of economic conservatism. So if you score higher on this scale, then you are more economically conservative. You have a more competitive and less cooperative bent of mind. I'll explain to you what this scale is in a minute. So as economic conservatism increases, your willingness to cooperate decreases. And we're going to use this scale. It just happens to be called right-wing authoritarianism, but think of this as an authoritarian scale, which is a measure of group conformism. And the idea that we are going to argue here is that when the authoritarianism scale increases, you are more likely to punish, or you are more likely to be punitive towards those who violate group norms. So you are less tolerant of things like, let's say, same-sex marriage, or things along those lines. Okay, so what are these scales? So let me just give you some ideas of the questions on these scales. The SDO, for instance, asks questions like, it is okay if some groups have more of a chance in life than others. Inferior groups should stay in their place. To get ahead in life, it is sometimes okay to step on others. Some of these, as you can see, are reverse code. We should have increased social equality. So here, of course, if you support this, then you're economically progressive. If you are economically conservative, you would disagree with this statement. It would be good if groups could be equal. We should do what we can to equalize conditions for different groups. All right, so the SDO scale asks a series of questions like this, and then you look at people's responses, you add up those scores, and people who score higher on the scale are more competitive. People who score low are more cooperative. I'm going to leave that up for a minute, to just in case you want to take another look at that, those questions. This is what's called a shorter version of the SDO scale. There's a much longer version. Some of this is actually derived from the work of Jim Sidenius. Jim Sidenius is in the faculty of psych at Harvard. So this is derived from a paper by Prato and Sidenius. Okay. What does the RWA scale look like? The RWA scale, these questions are a bit longish. For instance, it is always better to trust the judgment of the proper authorities in government and religion than to listen to the noisy rabble rousers in our society who are trying to create doubt in people's minds. It would be best for everyone if the proper authorities censored magazines so that people could not get their hands on trashy and disgusting material. Atheists and others who have rebelled against established religions are no doubt every bit as good and virtuous as those who attend church regularly. So RWA scale asks a series of questions like this. I'm going to put up those questions for you here. Right. So these are questions that try to get at this idea of group conformity, that you need to obey authority. That's about, in group, that's loyalty, sanctity, in-group loyalty, etc. Okay.
And Anish, we also have one question in the chat.
Sure.
Someone is asking if you can explain behavioral plasticity one more time.
Oh, so behavioral plasticity simply means that our behaviors are not completely mutable. So some characteristics are inherited. And at the same time, even if I have inherited a certain set of characteristics, some of those may be expressed more in some scenarios, right? For instance, in a situation of extreme scarcity, even cooperative people may become competitive, right? So just because we have some things, we have a genotype that codes for certain types of behavior, that doesn't necessarily mean that that's exactly what will happen under all circumstances. If our surrounding social circumstances change, then some of those preferences get expressed more than less, right? I mean, you understand this, right? I mean, in the United States now, things that we were reluctant to say out loud before have now become blasé. We say those things, right? But that's partly because of how kind of social media and the social milieu has evolved. And that in turn creates its own cycle where, you know, kind of certain types of behavior are no longer taboo, right? That's what behavioral plasticity means. That if you took those same people, so the people in the United States, if you do the same people who brought them over to New Zealand, they wouldn't be saying those kinds of things. They would be more tolerant of other views. That's what that means.
Great.
Okay.
And sorry, we just have one more clarifier.
Sure.
Someone is asking if you could give a brief elaboration on the meaning of balanced selection via fitness trade-offs that you had mentioned a couple slides back.
Yes. So fitness trade-off simply means that, let's think of the animal world, right? So the peacock's tail, for instance, right? So we know that the peacock's tail, the more luxurious, the more colorful your tail is, that indicates higher genetic quality. So that makes you more attractive to peahens. But as the tail gets larger, it also becomes more difficult to run away from predators. So that's the idea of fitness trade-off, that you want a larger tail, but those with larger tails might win over those with smaller tails, but those with very large tails may also lose out because they get killed by the predators, right? So these traits that we have, whether it's extroversion, neuroticism, these have a trade-off. Sometimes you want more, but not too much, right? So in nature, there's a balance between these things. So that's what's called balancing selection, that you are not going to move too far in one direction. So the tails will not get larger and larger and larger because of fitness trade-off. Now, sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't. For instance, to give you another example, in animals that are polygamous, males tend to be much larger than females. For instance, bull elephant seals are gigantic compared to female seals, because bull elephant seals typically have large harems of lots of female seals, and bull elephant seals fight each other to get control. So larger size is good, but at the same time, being too large might make you more difficult to run away from predators like whales, right? So that's the idea of kind of trade-offs in these traits. Okay, let me move on then. Okay, so at this point, what we did was, so Chris Sibley runs this thing called New Zealand Attitudes and Values Survey. So these are about 10,000 people who have been tracked for 10 years or so now. So if you have any questions about New Zealand, where do Kiwis stand on same-sex marriage? Where do Kiwis stand on ban on plastics? Chris has the answer to all these questions. Well, at least this representative sample of 10,000 people. So we recruited about 1,000 of these people from that survey, and we have them play a series of games. There are what we call 4 cooperation type of games. These are designed to measure cooperative tendencies. And we have 4 games that are designed to measure punishment tendencies. Now, I understand that most of you probably don't know all these games, but I'm hoping that many of you have a rudimentary idea of some of these games. But because I don't have time, I'm going to try and explain all of these games. Now, let me move on, and I will talk about the games along the way. So the first set of games are kind of designed to measure how people, a dictator game, it's simply one person gets a sum of money, and you can choose to share it with another person or not, and things along those lines, right? So the first set of games measure cooperative tendencies. The second ones are designed to measure punishment or norm enforcement tendencies. So we collect data from various places. Those of you who are not familiar, New Zealand has two islands, North Island, South Island. That large plot there, it's Auckland. The whole country has about 5 million people. About a third of those people live there in Auckland. That's where I live. That's Wellington, the capital. That's Christchurch, where the shootings took place. And that's Dunedin. So these are the four major cities. I'm going to go through this. We have reasonable variation in age, gender, etc. Okay. So our first hypothesis was that if you're right about this social versus economic dimension, then we expect these behavior in these games. So this tendency to cooperate and tendency to punish to load onto two distinct latent variables in factor analysis. Second, we expect that people who score higher on the social dominance scale will exhibit less cooperative tendencies. And finally, people who score higher on the authoritarian scale would be willing to punish violators of cooperative norms more. Okay. So let me go skip some of this. These are games that are all played online. People actually play this in real time. We have large groups of people who are kind of matched up. Kind of people make these decisions on an individual basis, and then we match them up later on. I can explain if there's a question. If not, that's not fundamental right now. Let's move on to the results. So does behavior load on to two latent factors? So again, this simply says, if I look at behavior for lots of people, can I put them into two different clusters? And the answer is yes. There is a distinct difference between what we call the cooperation games or behavior in the cooperation games. And there's a distinct difference between behavior in what we call the punishment games. So these do represent two fairly different sets of underlying preferences. What this also means in some senses is that you can take heights, harm, and fairness, and that would be subsumed by this factor here. And you can take heights, authority, sanctity, and in-group allegiances, and that would fit into this here. So you don't need 5 different things. You can kind of explain them by these two major drivers of human behavior. Okay. The second hypothesis says that if you score higher on the SDO scale, then you will be less willing to cooperate. Do we get that? Yes. I'm going to go to the next slide and I'll show you behavior in the different games separately. So the first one here is dictator game. It's simply here. What happens is Sarah and I are paired, and I have, let's say, $10, and I can share that $10 with Sarah if I want. What does this show? It simply shows that as my score on the SDO scale increases, I will share less money with Sarah. What's the TG1? TG1 is what's called the trust game. Here I'm paired with Sarah. I have $10. I can choose to send some of this money to Sarah. But if I send any money to Sarah, then that money is tripled. So if I send Sarah $5, Sarah will get $15. So essentially, I'm creating a surplus, and then Sarah gets $15. Then Sarah will get to decide if she wants to send any money back to me or not. But the game ends, so Sarah doesn't really have an incentive to send any money unless she's motivated by reciprocal tendencies. So the idea is that by sending Sarah some money, I'm reposing trust on her, hoping that she'll reciprocate that trust. A lot of work in this area has been done by your academic dean, a friend of mine, Iris Bonet. She has done a lot of work in this area, looking at trust and trustworthiness. So this first one says, do I send money to Sarah? Do I trust Sarah? Well, as my SDO score goes up, I send less money to Sarah. What does Sarah do? I've sent her money. I have taken a risk, sent her money. Now, if she keeps the entire money, she's better off, I'm worse off. Does she return enough money? Because I'm sure you understand that if I don't send any money, I have $10. Sarah has nothing, let's say. But if I send all my money to Sarah, if I send all $10, then Sarah has $30 now. If Sarah sends 15 back to me, then I'm better off, so is she, right? So the second move is Sarah's willingness to reciprocate my trust. Does that change? Yes. As Sarah's SDO score increases, she becomes less trusting. Or sorry, she becomes less trustworthy. This fifth game, the public goods game, is really a social dilemma where you can either cooperate or you can defect. And again, as the SDO score increases, people become less cooperative. I'm going to skip this stag hunt game for now. Okay. We also asked people questions along these lines. Are you willing to sacrifice monetarily for the environment? The answer is, as the cooperation increases or the SDO score increases, people are more willing to sacrifice for the environment. If incomes were more equal, people would be less motivated to work hard. This is a competitive view of the world. As we see, as SDO increases, people say, yes, more. So they're less cooperative. They're less tolerant of welfare payments. Support for income distribution, same thing. Cooperation increases, people, when SDO scores increase, people support income distribution less. Okay. So we find strong support for this economic conservative dimension, which is that as people score higher on the SDO scale, they become less cooperative. Just to give you an idea, this is the National Party in New Zealand is the right of center party. So think of this as the Republican Party, but nowhere close, not even close, because even the right of center party here is probably considered communist by Republicans. But anyway, left of center is Labour. So what happens as people's scores on the SDO scale increase, notice, sorry, I said it wrong. People's cooperative score or score on the SDO scale decreases, their support for national goes down. And so people who are more competitive tend to support the right of center parties. People who are more cooperative tend to support the left of center parties. And the same is true of the Green Party in New Zealand. Okay. I'm going to do this very quickly by saying that this idea that authoritarianism is a measure of punishment, we don't find any evidence of this. Authoritarianism, whatever it measured, it doesn't measure punishment. We do know that it measures in-group love. But I'm going to pause here for a minute and let Sarah decide if I should continue or answer questions.
Yeah, I think maybe we only have a couple moments left. So if we can answer
Okay.
one or two questions.
Sure.
So I think we had one question here from Clement. So Clement, I will unmute your microphone so you're able to ask your question.
Yes, thank you. Thanks for the presentation. I had one question which was related to the RWA scale. This work has been, I understand, conducted at the national level in New Zealand. But how well do you see that scale traveling, especially all the questions related to religion and church? How well do you think that would travel to more secular societies, let's say some Western European countries or Chinese society, for instance? Do you think that a large issue in cross-country comparisons if we were to do that at a more international level?
No, so the RWA scale is from Bob Altmaier, who is the University of Toronto in Canada. So this is very much, and kind of think of this as a North American version. There are much longer questions. I take your point that there's a kind of a more charge bias. So I think the longer version of the scale travels reasonably well, because most people kind of understand that the charge questions are more about kind of obedience to authority, but whether it applies to, say, China, I don't have a good answer. It actually probably is a bit less relevant in New Zealand, where religion is not a very, very big part. But as I said, there's a longer version, and a lot of it is about kind of this in-group loyalties and things like that, right? I'm going to say one thing, just okay. Anyway, sorry. So the scale is reasonably okay, but as with most scales, it doesn't apply to every society. But if you touch base with me later on, we are now currently trying this out in the small island called Vanuatu, where we are doing some field work. So we'll see if it translates there.
Great, fantastic. We have probably time for one more question, and Tanya in the chat is asking, are there variations in the SDO score by gender?
Are there variations in SDO? That's a very good question, Tanya. I should have thought of this before. I think so, but I don't have the breakdown. But having done quite a bit of gender work, I appreciate that question. I think in general, the evidence suggests, not in general, I know that the evidence suggests that women are more cooperative in collective action problems. There's a lot of evidence. Women are more cooperative, more generous in the dictator game. Whether that translates into the SDO score or not, I don't have a good answer right now. I'll look it up. If you send me an email, I can get back to you. Just do Google search with my name.
Great, fantastic. Thank you so much, Anish. And thank you all for joining us. And we hope that you'll join us for our next speaker series on October 9th.